Welcome. Thank you for welcoming me. I haven't been this far north in Canada before. This is my northernmost limit, and it feels very warm here. That's what I heard. You can keep going.
We brought this weather in just especially for you.
I love it. It's like always snowing in Canada is what they say in the States. As soon as you get over the border, it's snowing. I'm a big maple syruper myself. I'm a big fan of maple syrup. I love the season, and I think that transcends the border, huh? Between Vermont and Ontario, it's like, you know, the ritual of coming around. I have this saying that I finally came up with, which is that once you tap the first tree, it's the promise of spring. Because in the beginning, it's like this high snowpack, right? And I'm tapping the trees, you know, somewhere around here. And then by end of spring, all the snow's gone, and my taps are up here, you know. and I'm really appreciating some of the things you've been saying, like this idea of lineage, and you know, your relationship to nature, and how it creates a kind of response, a resilient response to changes. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, nature is just grooming us all the time for rolling with the punches. And how do we get by? How do we do that? You know? Well, I know the more rural you get and the more you're out in the open, you really have to rely on the people around you. I took this course once in raising rabbits for meat. And this guy, you know, people were saying, I don't know if I want to raise rabbits for meat, because once you get involved with the animals, then it's like you can't get out. Right? It's like, yeah, I know what you mean, but one way of thinking of it is you could rely on your neighbors to support you. If you have to go away, there's certain times of years you could plan it. For example, my neighbor, he has a greenhouse. And it's a really large greenhouse that he gets all his starts going for the farm. And one year, this big windstorm came in and blew all the plastic off in the middle of the night. And that was like $20,000 worth of crops right there. And he didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and he called me at 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, James, you have to get down here right now. My whole greenhouse just blew off. And so he said, and I knew the right thing to do is just up and go, you know. And I woke my teenage son and we went over there at 2 o'clock in the morning. We worked till dawn putting that whole thing back together again and saved 90% of his crops. Right? That's how we get by, right? When we're closer to nature, is we realize we have to be like nature. That makes sense? Like, we have to really be like nature and be interrelated. And so what I want to see is that kind of spirit moving down through time. Maybe the older generations get this, you know, but the newer generations, they have a few more challenges, some distractions around. Well, maybe we don't need nature anymore. Have you seen some of those distractions creep into your lives, your grandchildren's lives? Maybe it's media. You know, there's takes them away from the moment, right? How do we keep that ethic going through the generations and keep the value up? So with my daughter, for example, I make sure from the time she was 0 that when it was maple syrup time, I would always bring her out to the trees. You know, and I would make this extra effort. You know, I'd talk about it and storytell about it. It's almost that time. Pay attention, you know, wait for the day. There's going to be the day. You know, there's a certain feeling in the air. There's a certain feeling there. You just know it's the day to tap the trees, you know. And when you do, you know, for her it was always about syrup. For me it was about spring, but for her it was about sugar, right? It's like the perfect mentoring lineage seasonal ritual. It's got to involve candy somewhere, you know. You know what I'm saying? But later on, it'll have other meaning. But for kids, it's got to be about candy. So she's all about it. She wouldn't miss it for the world. So she's always paying attention. You know, like, what am I watching for? You'll know. Just keep watching the leaves and the weather. You know, watching the buds, watching the birds that are happening. And eventually, she started noticing icicles were a real key, right? Because like if branches rub, you know, sugar maples will rub, and then they drip when it's a warm day, and then at night when it's cool, they'll freeze. Right? You get these odd icicles in the middle of trees. I mean, you see them in houses, but like one day she was like, why is there an icicle in the middle of that tree, Papa? You know, we ask a lot of questions in our family. And she's like, why is it one icicle hanging up in that tree? I'm like, wow, that's a good question. We should explore that. She's like, well, I'll climb up there. And I'm like, okay, you know. So we stop the car. We're usually just, you know, zooming in on the driveway with the car. I'm like, well, this is actually, like, I know where this goes, right? So I'm going to feed this. Turn my watch off, put it in my pocket, you know, cancel my schedule, because I know this could take a couple hours. But it's worth it, right? Because where's this going to go? She's got a curiosity about nature and the mystery. I want to foster that curiosity. I want to let her know that I think that's important. And how does an adult show children that they're important? That what they think and say is important? What's the secret there? Giving them attention, quality attention in the moment. It's one of the hardest things to do when we're too busy. I mean, I'm guilty of this. I've blown off my child a lot. I don't have time. I don't have time. And I know what that feels like to be the child too, right? So it's like, oh, will you play catch with me, Dad? You know, so it's like, I don't have time, right? So I want to bring that back. I want to value that. So I have a commitment to myself. And I even have a commitment with Chris that if he catches me not giving my daughter enough time, he'll call me on it, you know? Hey, you spending time with your daughter? I'm like, yeah, thanks for asking, you know? So we park the car right there in the middle of the driveway. And we go over to the tree, and we have a rule, like, I can never lift her up into a tree she can't already get into. Yeah? Which means that she'll be big enough to be in the tree that she's in. So she gets up into the tree, and she climbs out the tree, and just a little kind of a hairy, little traverse thing going on with the branches, you know. They're getting a little thinner as she goes out. You know? And then just as she gets down there, the icicle breaks off and falls to the ground. Oh, I'm like, it's okay, it's not here, come on back, you know. It's all the way back. Couldn't have done it without you, you know. So she comes back, and he comes down and scoots over. Don't touch it, don't touch it, don't touch it, I don't want to touch it. You know, she comes back, she picks up the icicle, she's like, oh, this is so cool, you know. We're looking up there, what did you see up there? Oh, I forgot to look. I said, taste it. She goes, oh, taste it, okay. She tastes it, she goes, oh, Papa, it's sweet. Taste this, is it sweet? Yeah, I'm like, yeah, what kind of tree do you think this is? She's like, it's a sugar maple. I'm like, yeah. She goes, oh, is this sap from the tree? I'm like, yeah. She goes, let's cut a bunch of the branches. I go, yeah, we could do that, but we could also just go tap the trees. He's like, oh, yeah, sign of spring, you know, let's go tap the trees, right? So, you know, this particular year, we were super excited. Like, we had been building for a couple of years around this. And in the old days, when she was like a little tot, you know, I would always drill a second hole next to the buckets, because she'd always want to, like, look up into the buckets and rip them off the tree. So I made this really long tap with a rubber tube on it that she could pull out of the bucket and just kind of like a little chupa, you know? Mother Nature, you know? So then she could put it back in the bucket, and it's kind of like her tree, so I didn't care. She could drink it as much as she wanted to. She did it with all her friends, you know, several times a day, just... Anyway, so she knows about that whole scene, so it's like, she's like, oh, so let's go drill the trees, right? So I get all the stuff set up, and I said, well, here we go. You know, it's always a big deal to drill a tree. How many people drill maple trees? Yeah? Okay. So you know that it's kind of like, you know, it's just a tree, it's just a drill kind of side of me. Then there's this kind of side of me, it's like, oh, I'm gonna like drill into this tree that I really appreciate. So I kind of want to do it right. Like kind of shooting a deer, you know? It's like, I don't want to injure it. I want to kill it the first time or miss, right? So if you drill like a little wobbly or a little unfocused and you put the tap in there, what happens? Yeah, it ripples down the tree. And I always feel like, that's not who I want to be. I don't want to go through life unconscious and have sap dribble down the side of the tree, so to speak. If I'm going to make an impact on nature, I want to use it well. I want all of it to go into the bucket, and we have a thing in our family, we don't spill a drop. We don't spill a drop, ever, because we appreciate it. So, it wasn't until, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So I'm the one who's drilling the tree at this point, and so before I do, I'm like, okay, are you ready? I say, well, let's give something to the tree. So we have this feeling of sacrifice, like, what are we going to give to the tree? You know, like, oh, well, let's pluck a hair. Like, in the old days, like, natives would give tobacco, right? And that was a sacrifice because they grew the thing and it took a long time to tend this crop. And so we'll pluck a hair, you know? She's like, rips a whole like 10 hairs out of her head. Ow! Like, one will do, you know, but that's good. So we gave the tree hair, and she's just all into it. And she's like, thank you, maple tree, you know. I'm like, yeah, thank you, tree, here we go. So I drill the tree, you know. And I'm going like, crud, nothing's coming out. You know, I thought it was the day. You know, I'm like, feeling like, oh, this is bad modeling. I drilled the tree and it's not the day, you know. And I go, it's not dripping. She's like, yeah, well, I know why. I'm like, oh, good, why? And she's like, well, we need to sing to the tree, you know. That's why. I'm like, you're right. What, you know, what should we sing? She just launches right into it. It's like if I give her the space to follow her original instructions, somehow she already knows. Do you know what I mean? It's like I could lead my whole life just following her, you know, in her natural instructions of being a human being, with, you know, direction and guidance, right? Like I have my role, I look like I'm leading. You know? This way, honey. Oh, this way, honey. This way now. Because there's a part of you that gets in the way, you know? That gets in the way. So she's having like kind of my childhood plus. Like I wanted to have everything I had and then some. Like a little more nature time, a little more connection with family, a little more time out, a little more love. Like leave a surplus, you know, in the next generation. So I make all those extra efforts all the time, and it's an investment. So I just follow her on this, and she says, maple tree, we love you. And I go, we offer you thankfulness for all that you do. And we're kind of improvising here, right? We write a lot of songs together like this in the car, you know? And she goes, so please, 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 drip. I'm like, great. She goes, I go, wow, if we sing that song, maybe it'll drip, you know? So we just hang the bucket and we go away. And then we go in the house and we're doing stuff, and I hear her calling from her bedroom as she's playing with some toys. Maple tree, we love you. And then she waits, and I'm in the dishes. We offer you thankfulness for all that you do. So please, 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 drip. Like times like 50. You know how kids are. It's like repetition's like what it's all about. So there we go. You know, we're going now. And this is another investment. It's like, do I really want to be singing this song 50 times today? You know, I got stuff to do, right? Remember I was going down the driveway, you know, at one point? Like my whole day is gone. My whole day is gone. And yet, you know, if that's not the way I invest my time with the child, what will come to fill its place? TV jingles? You know, I've memorized a lot of commercials growing up. And I don't remember actually ever being taught them, but it was the repetition. Where were my parents when I was watching 250 commercials a day? You know? I've memorized hundreds and hundreds of logos. I know all sorts of jingles, right? Movie stars. There's all sorts of stuff I know. It has nothing to do with anything real, except for buying someone else's stuff, right? It's a really clever thing that's come into our households, right? It eats at our table. Eats right at our table, you know? So this is a way, I call it the pushback. The pushback. Just making a little more space for the real and the now. And nature's kind of the core of what I go as my pathway, because it's like, it's only a non-man-made thing. It's pretty darn real and alive and dynamic, and I have to be like nature in order to relate to it. So I like it. And it's like going to the gym, you know? Requires some extra effort, right? But I feel buff and healthier afterwards. And I want her to have that experience. So I just bring as many people along for the ride as I can, and she just goes in the wake, like, right? Because there's this wall of adults and kids and family and teenagers all going in that direction. She just feels the draft. You know, it's like easy. You know what I mean? I mean, it could be cell phones and internets, right? And Facebook. That could be sucking her this way, right? So it takes a lot of extra effort. So it's not just me and her. It's me and her mom and her and her friends and her friends' parents and her, and teenagers and her, and the whole village and her. And that's pretty much how I live my life. Obsessively creating community and forward-thinking vision for commonplace activities like love, tapping maple trees, singing. That's her reality. Someday I can't wait to talk to her about all this, you know. How was your childhood, you know? Because for her, it's just kind of the way it is. You know what I mean? Like, she's kind of probably going to discover someday it wasn't like that for everybody. But if she gets to sit with you, or you know, you'll probably have this really great bond, you know, like, we did the same thing, you know, it's really similar. Like, the farther back you go, either in our culture, or I've had a chance to go to Europe and go to Austria, up in the mountains there in Tyrol, and they're old mountain people up there, culturally. And they're just a really deep, earthy stock of Europeans, which is kind of neat. Like, in a European sense, they're relatively indigenous. It's cool. And they're super hardy people, and the things they do with their kids are super outrageous, you know. Like, they're alpine skiers on slopes like this. That's about the right angle. Like, the top cause of death for tourists over there is falling down mountains. Because they step off, there's no guardrails, of course, it's not about safety there. Yeah, because you just know, right? But somehow, like, I'll say Americans, somehow Americans like think like everything is super protected and safe, so they walk over the guardrail, and they take a picture, they slip, and they fall 250 meters. No kidding, you know? That's their day-to-day life. Avalanches, you know? You drive down the highway there in the valleys, and there's these intense, like, 3-foot block concrete ceilings over the road. I'm like, what are these things that we're going under? They're like, avalanche protectors. Like, oh God, you know? Hope that doesn't happen, you know? And so sledding over there is like a serious edge. You ever go sledding as a teenager? It's serious business over there. Like, if you don't go with the right tools and the right time and the right place, they told me this story. They go out, right? And you know, they'll go out at night, of course, and they'll go out with some, like, apple schnapps, something they make from their local apple trees. You know, it's medicine for the cows, right? It is. They have this kind of like exchange thing going on where the guy who collects the apples in the apple cart, and he makes the schnapps and he gives it back to the farmers in exchange for the apples, and they use it to sterilize the cows, you know, and then they take a few. And anyway, so apple schnapps is a big cultural drink there. The teens go up and they go up way up at the top of the snow line, way above the tree line, and they go sledding down these things, right? And you just go on your butt. And you can use your feet as brakes and stuff, but if you're not careful and you get a little out of control, your feet are braking all the time. You're going 20, 30 miles an hour, and then they say your legs give out. They just become like rubber, and they just give out, and then you just go for like a quarter mile, kilometer, half a kilometer. Does that convert? But can you imagine like how intense that is? Like, that's real business. And there's no like litigation around it, you know, people aren't suing each other over it. It's the reality of their environment. It creates them. And it wasn't until recently, you know, I got to go over there and do an art of mentoring there. So it's a very different course than, let's say, doing it in New York City, you know, or California or London. They have a whole bunch of things in place already, from what we're calling, let's say, an older culture where they're used to mentoring and passing on these basic ways of life that I'm talking about. But they're noticing some things that are coming into the village. And it started with a good idea, which was paving the roads. They paved the roads with tar, you know, so they're real smooth. And, you know, because otherwise rocky, muddy roads, they become inaccessible and it's slower, and technology doesn't want to go up there, you know, kind of like Napoleon doesn't want to go up there. But soon as the roads got tarred, then people started buying modern cars going up in there. And then telephone wires and electricity cables and computers, like boom, 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 boom. And then things kind of just, they kind of blinked and things left like lederhosen, which was their clothing made out of leather. Think about that. Lederhosen is kind of like a joke, you know, when you think about people living in the Alps, lederhosen, you know, those weird things they wear with the overalls and stuff. But as a traditional outfit, it's made from leather. Their clothes are made from leather. What does that remind you of? You know, like Indians, kind of a thing. Like they're from the cows of their cows and their meadows behind their house up on the mountainsides. They made their own clothing, you know, cultural clothing. It was just what was. Then boom, that just kind of faded away. And then quickly it led to people working in the city to pay for the computers, to pay for the cars. And then they didn't have time for farming as much. And so farming became kind of like marginalized to between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. and between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. depending on the season. And then they're spending the rest of their day either commuting or in front of a computer. And then guess what happened? Less time for the kids, right? So then they had to put kids in school more, you know, as a way of educating them for that possible future to do more of the same of that. And there wasn't a lot of thinking with it. It was just kind of like we're just going with the way things are going, like that draft I was talking about, right? It just is happening, like a slowly boiling pot of water or something. You can't really tell the temperature's changing until maybe it's too late. So us being there, we just took a pause for a minute and we said, hey, let's check in. How is things working right now? We're not used to asking this question. We're used to believing that our culture is supporting itself through time. We're used to believing in what we knew that was good for us is good for our children, is good for their children, and just passing things forward. But maybe we need to take a time out and have a counsel on how is it working. Are we keeping the good things from the past? How are the indicators in our children showing up? Are they healthy, vital? Are they alive? Are they truly helpful? Are they compassionate towards themselves and others? You know, how is their quality of their heart? Are they respectful? Do they have a quiet mind? You know, when they're in the woods, can they be silent? How's their hunting skills? You know, how's their knowledge of place? Can they catch 3 or 4 different species of fish year-round? What does it take to know how to do that? Are they able to observe and study before making judgments? Because that kind of assessment is important when you're thinking about when to plant the crops. That assessment's important before you step into a community decision. What are all the factors here? And then having forward-thinking thoughts, like how's this going to affect the next generation? So we had that kind of a conversation in the context of this thing called the Art of Mentoring. And the Art of Mentoring is a week of being together, asking these big picture questions, and also doing some oral history storytelling of where have we come from as a human race, you know? What is our lineage? What are some of the things that human beings have in common when we go all the way back? What's our purpose for being here on the planet? And what's the possibility? So it's like a renewal of culture. It's just so that we don't get sucked in a draft by accident on some recent ideas that maybe aren't so good for us. Does that make sense? And the reason why mentoring got put into the title is because I don't think we can take for granted that just because we do it, the kids are going to do it. Used to be so, because we were all on the same page around what was important. But there's a whole other things in play now that maybe don't have our children's best interest in mind. And they have a lot more dollars than we do. Like the rising, the greatest advertising population right now, what do you call it, the market segment that they're advertising to the most is 0 to 5 years old. Because they can now. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it's like $5 billion a year. They're spending money on marketing 0 to 5 years old. Not that they're going to buy anything, but they become loyal to the brands later when they pester their parents and they get into that pester marketing age, or whatever they call that. You know what I mean? Like, the bother parents is like a $200 million industry or whatever. And, you know, since culture's turning kids at the top and adults and elders at the bottom, you know, they run the culture now and that kind of stuff. So I just want to question that for a second and make sure that we're raising our children. I'm using a we statement, but I'm assuming you're here with some curiosity around that. Because if we don't raise our own children, someone else will. It's kind of the state of the day. Which means we have to do something different we've never done before. I believe we're at a place in human history that's super unique and requires some creativity. That culture is this invisible set of parameters that help guide people through time that aren't necessarily explicit. But they're values that are woven into the conduct and practices that a certain number of people have in common. Things we value. So if you were in a certain place, and like this room, for example, here has a different culture than Toronto. And we can test it by doing something like, let's do this thing called gratitude. What are you thankful for? And the gratitude here was different than the gratitude in Toronto. You could feel it in the room. There was a depth of relationship to nature that was different. So I know it would be different if nothing else were different, and I just plunked my child down here versus plunk my child down over there. She would grow up more nature connected, and you wouldn't actually ever be talking about it. I just know that already. And that's kind of an invisible thing, like fishes to water. They don't really know they're in the water they're swimming in. And that's generally worked out, I think, over time. You know? However, we may be for the first time in human history that we need to examine how culture gets created and passed forward. We may actually have to step back and have a little bit of a designer hat once in a while. Like, a couple of different ways we could do that. One way I do it in my community is we actually take 4 or 5 days out every year between Christmas and the New Year. Somewhere around that time of year. Just after the darkest nights, you know? And sun starts to return. So it's like a natural seasonal cycle anyway, where the world is beginning to turn the corner and waking up again. So I suppose now there's a practice called New Year's resolutions and that kind of thing, but this is a little bit like deeper. It's a several-day reflection around, so how did last year work for everybody? Did we have enough time for our kids? Did we get outside enough? How's the health of our crops? Are we exchanging and saving seeds? How's the GMO thing working out? Are we dancing enough? Are our children learning music? There's a lot of great traditional tunes here, and I know so-and-so is probably not going to be here much longer. Is anyone learning the fiddle from him? How about that great apple pruner, that grandmother? She knows how to, what's it called, propagate apples, you know? Does anyone know how to do that anymore? Because she's so good at that. I'm just concerned no one's learning from her. And that kind of a thing. Or maybe they talk about their children. Hey, what are the gifts that so-and-so is emerging with this year? You seen some changes in her, you know? Yeah, she's really, starting to, enjoy little children. Oh, that's great. She's 12 years old? Yeah. Well, maybe she could do some babysitting for so-and-so, They're having a new baby right now, and a mother helper would really be great for her. And just crafting all the kind of culture you'd like to see. And it's a different time that we would have to have such a conscious conversation about it. But in doing so, we have a little more say in the result of how our kids turn out. And maybe, like my daughter, your children will grow up, or maybe their children, in a whole different way of being where they don't have to be so conscious about it anymore. And we can take all the stuff we learned and put it in a little manual and put it behind glass and just write, in case of emergency, break glass. Read this thing. We had to do it for a generation, We had to get conscious for a little while about, like in Toronto they have a day a year they celebrate. It's called Get Outside. Yeah. Get Outside Day, And I just learned that yesterday. I go, when is it? I don't want to miss it, Yeah, it's like Tuesday, April 17th. I'm like, great, I'll be sure to be there, I'll check it off my list of things to do this year, and I'll feel good about that. But it was great. The woman who brought it up, she's like a big educator for the city of Toronto. She was at our talk, and I was really glad that she was there because I think this was seeding some big ideas for her, you know. And I was also a little challenging to her worldview. That's okay. Got to take some risks, right? So she's like, you know, first I thought that's great, get outside day, you know. I really liked the sound of it. And then I was like, that's disturbing. Get outside day? What are we talking about? We have to have a day, first of all? You know, like we just don't do it and then one? You know, I don't get it. That's disturbing, you know. Yeah, well, it's all we can budget, you know. Like, limited amount of time. We got a lot of things to do, you know, a lot of important things to do. So that's one idea, right? Is to take a pause and actually get together and ask those bigger picture questions, and let your questions be informed by some of the deeper patterns of the past. Now, I've had the good fortune of spending a lot of time in my life, the last 15 years, researching around the world, what have indigenous cultures had in common? I wanted to find out who the nature connection masters were, right? Because it was the one place I really felt like if I could pattern my children on nature, they're going to develop the kind of responses and resiliency to change that I'm looking for, that are going to resonate that I am nature. Otherwise, there's all sorts of other cultural things they could do that would be enriching, you know. But it's the one non-man-made place. It's like the rebooting of the human software place. If I want to get a regenerative surplus, leave it better than I found it, it's going to be there. I trust it. Otherwise, there's some questionable things around programs and religion and whatever, you know. It's like, I'm not sure how they're all working exactly. There's some kind of jury's out in a number of areas, right? But at least I know in nature it's the first non-man-made place to go to reboot. And then from there she can make up her own worldviews around spirituality and whatnot, right? So, I forgot where I was going with that. Anyway, so taking a time out each year is a really important way to reboot. And, oh, I know. So going back to the past and just fast forward. So I've had the good fortune of traveling around the world and meeting Native people and also exploring ancestry, because my ancestors were Native too. I'd like you to consider that idea if you haven't. If we go back far enough, your lineage is Native. True or not true?
True.
That's an empowering statement. A lot of people don't want to say that because of race relation tensions. You know, it's like, I'm the bad white person, you know, right? Bad European, good Native. You know, sometimes that occurs, right? White man's guilt, I've been called, you know, been told that. Or historical guilt. I'm taking responsibility for all of the history, right, of this continent between natives and non-natives. Historical trauma. But if we go back far enough, we have to look at the interconnection not just between things right now, which would be the interrelationship in the natural world or the interrelationship between people, right? That's acting like nature, but also through time. This is also a very common Native perspective, is to have an oral history of where we've come from. I've noticed that sense of time has gotten narrow as well. If you ask children, what's the oral history of their places? The stories that you know about place. Do they know those stories? You know, could they tell you about those stories? Could they tell you about the landscape? Could they tell you what was here before? Could they tell you about the industry of this region and how people got here and all those kinds of things? Could they tell you about the family values and what ancestral hero in their bloodline brought that teaching into the family lineage? Because that's how it is when you talk to certain Native people. Like when I talk with Gilbert Walking Bull, he could tell you about 150, 200, 300 of his relatives in the family tree. He had an amazing oral history mind. Of course, that's the way he was raised. So he didn't have books or TV or libraries or teachers who gave him information, right? Because if they're always giving you information, then you don't really have to learn. First thing I learned as a kid. They got all information, I can always ask them whatever, so I don't really have to listen to all that information, right? But in an indigenous childhood like Gilbert's, they never really told him things, they pulled him. Right? So if he wanted to learn about something, they'd ask him a question versus give him information. So he'd have to step towards it if he was curious. He was always involved in his learning and became a lifelong curious human being. Very different learning educational style, and it's worth picking back up again. So he never had the comfort, we use that term, he never had the comfort of information prepackaged in a book. There's a part of me that says, I don't really have to learn that because I can go on the internet and get it. I mean, certainly the younger generation feels that way, right? And even books requires a little more effort. Going to the library, remember going to the library, and looking up books, that kind of stuff. But for him, it wasn't even that. So if somebody told him a story, that might be the only time ever that he ever hears that story ever again. So his brain, and all the brains of the people around him, had a capacity for absorbing information the first time. The first time. Or death might occur to somebody that he knows. Like there was not any room for laziness on some level in terms of learning capacity. Children came home with information about the landscape, everybody wanted to know. You can't just go out there unconscious and run around and play. Pay attention. Because what might they find out there? There might be some certain hazards that are going on. You never know. Natural wildfires burning. Enemies in the territory. Some kind of disease is happening. You never know. Everyone's always paying attention all the time. What are you observing out there? What are you seeing? So they get this questioning at the end of the day. And they knew the next day, like, it would happen all over again. So they play, but have this kind of extrasensory attention going on. Keeps them on their edge of their seat. So he had a great capacity for learning songs and history, and I had a chance to travel around with him for a while, and he could tell me things about my landscape in New England. He's from the Midwest, South Dakota. He could tell me about my landscape for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. There's a mountain in my area called Mount Monadnock that just rises right up out of the ground. And it's a prominent place and people like to hike it, but like that's about it, kind of like that's all they ever really hear about. Great place to hike, You ever hike up there now? Yeah, it's really great. But he's like, that's one of the 7 sacred mountains of this continental United States. That's one of the 7 sacred mountains. And he goes on for like 2 hours about it. I'm like, whoa. He's not even from here, Like, what else does he know? And so I asked him all sorts of things about his childhood, about how he was raised, because I wanted to get a few clues, like, how could I raise my daughter? I want her to have that capacity to pay attention. How many of you have tried to tell something to a child and they just didn't listen to you? Just a couple? I want to have that relationship with her, especially if I have a certain tone of voice, like, this is important, that she actually listens. That's what I want. Because I'm not messing around when I have something important to say. That's something I know is true for me. I don't waste my words, right? So I want her to receive those certain words the first time. Whatever they are, Whatever they are. So they come around once in a while. And so Gilbert had that relationship with his elders. He told me this story once. Like, I invited him out to my hometown. And it was a major journey. He was 70, I think. And I wanted him to meet the children at my nature program I was running, much like Chris and Laura do. And I was a little nervous because, he was super traditional elder. And he was raised by his grandparents because something was going on with his parents that I didn't get all the information on, but I know about historical trauma, that there was whole generations of people knocked out by depression, suicide, diabetes, alcohol, and it's just a result of oppression, essentially, right? So his grandparents removed him and adopted him closer to this other village, and there was 13 other children there. And essentially, it was a cluster of houses of ceremonial people, 26 of them, men and women, elders. So it was like, that was his world. he grew up with unbroken lineage ceremonial leaders as a baseline. That's a high dosage, you know, that's a high dose. And their language even reflected that. Ceremonial leaders had certain prayers and songs in their oral history mind that went extra farther back, you know? So their language was an older stock language that had different meaning to it. So he would say, you know, people today, they say, Ikche Wichasha, you know, it means like, hey dude, but that's not what it really means. You know, Ikche Wichasha means common man, meaning one with all things. And it's what we all seek to become is Ikche Wichasha, one with all things. But today they say it means to be a common dude, but that's not what it means. You know, I loved that. I was like, whew. So when I invited him out, I was like, I really want this to go well, but I heard through the grapevine he doesn't like children. You know, and I was like, that just sounds like, why doesn't he like children? You know, but it's kind of like, it was only like half the story, but that's what I got. And I kind of did a little more snooping, and it was like, I think it's like he didn't like the last experience he had with children, because they were like in a school, and they weren't paying attention. But it was like they were probably really disrespectful. Can you imagine a traditional elder coming in and kids just blowing them off? Like, I was like, oh, I really don't want to do that. And so I asked his wife at the time, Diane, you know, I'd like you guys to come out and meet the kids that I work with, because I'm really intending for these children to have a different childhood than ever before, you know, like going back. The game was essentially, can we raise our children with the level of native knowledge and connection of our ancestors? So it looked like a program, but that was really my intention. And I was willing to do any kind of cultural facilitation that was going to allow that to happen. And they were homeschoolers, so I had a little bit of room to do that. So she asked him, and she's like, no, Gilbert doesn't really like children. He doesn't want to spend any time with them. But we'll come out anyway, and he says he'd like to do some sweat lodge teachings, you know, healing lineage. So he's a sweat lodge leader. I'm like, okay, you know, but I really want him to meet the kids, you know. She's like, well, I don't know, maybe you can ask him when he gets there. I'm like, okay, but like this is going to be a 3-month process, right? Like ask him when he gets there, you know. Okay, I surrender. So I say to the kids, all right, hey, guess what? 3 months from now, we're going to have a visitor, right? And they're like, oh, great. You know, I'm like, his name is Gilbert Walking Bull, and he's a descendant of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, right? And I tell him the whole story about how I grew up with these grandmas and grandpas out in the plains, and special person. He's a really great storyteller and singer and dancer, and he has really great teachings, you know. So we have to prepare for his visit. How can we welcome him to our place, you know? So now I'm setting up this is a cultural mentoring moment I'm having with them, right? I've already set the assumption that we are going to welcome him, because there's some places that don't welcome people. You know what I mean? So how do we welcome him? How would you feel honored and proud to introduce him to this place, you know? Like, oh, well, I suppose we could, you know, he could be in the Mandan Lodge with us, you know? We could make a fire for him and give him a cup of tea. Like, great. What should we make tea out of? What would be local to this place? They're like, we could make hemlock tea. No, birch bark. Birch tea would be great, because it tastes good. Like, yeah, great, birch tea. So we'll make birch tea. And I said, when you give a present to somebody, do you want to give them something that you like, you know, or something that they like? And they were like, give him something that he likes, right? I said, well, when I was out there a long time ago, I heard him walk into a setting where I was in, and there were some teenagers there, and this was another wilderness school out in Washington State, and Gilbert was there at the time. And I was hanging out with them, and Gilbert walked in, and he just kind of started in like at the middle. Yeah, it'd be really great. You know, when I was a kid, my grandpa used to collect the chinchasha, and he'd scrape the outer bark of the chinchasha and use that inner bark for his ceremonial mix. We'd go out there, way out in that special wetland, and we'd gather those materials and we'd bring it back to him so he could have ceremonies. And then he left. You you know? And the kids were kind of like, oh, you know, and they went off to do what they're doing. I said, hey, did you guys see that? They're like, see what? I'm like, he just asked us to go find some chinchasha. I'm like, no, he didn't. I'm like, yeah, he did. No, I'm sure he didn't. I'm like, I'm sure he did. I said, why do you think he just told us that story? And they're like, I really don't know. Do you think maybe, you know? I don't know. I'm like, no, really, I really do. I really think that's what he's saying, you know? So we did, you know, and so I told my kids that story, and they're like, let's go get some, right? So we happen to have a wetland there, and we harvested all of this red willow. You know that red willow that grows in the swamps? And you get it at a certain time of year before the leaf comes out because the medicine is still in the inner bark. You ever seen the inner bark of that stuff? You take off the red, and it's like this beautiful lime green on the inside. It smells really good. So you scrape that off, but you can't get any of the wood in there. You know, because if you go below the green and get that little white wood, and you put that in the ceremonial tobacco, then it's like you're burning, you know, wood chips in your pipe, right? That's not going to work. So you have to be really particular. So it wasn't just gathering that, it was the scraping process, and, you know, how many of these that we did not do well. And they say, there, look at this. And I look at them, I'm like, he would die of emphysema if he smoked that. I said, that's really great. We're going to have to do that again, but that looks great. Good first round, you know. So this is part of the slow build up, you know, towards giving him something that he likes, you know, like what we had to learn. And eventually, you know, the teenagers of the kids that we had ended up making the best chinchasha, so we gave that to him. But the other thing I wanted to do was I wanted to sing him a song in his language, because he had taught us a lot of songs already. And what was really intense is like when he taught us a song, like he taught us the song once called the Earth Honoring Song. And unlike songs that you learn on the radio today, it's like there's always like some CD you could get, you know, or it's produced like 2 years ago, or, you know, or you can find it on the internet, or it's on the radio. It's like, I don't know, like a disposable commodity or something, right? He'd say, this song, I want to teach you this song, comes from Sitting Bull. He was up on this mountain this year, you know, 18 whatever, and it was a time during the reservations when the government was coming in and the people were selling the land to them. And he went up and fasted up on this mountain, and he came down with this song that says, what are you doing? You cannot sell the land. You cannot sell the land to these people. Pay attention to what you're doing. And then he goes off and he starts singing the song, and I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I might be the only person learning this song. Like, who knows this song? You know what I mean? And like, there's like no recorders, right? I know that he's been outcasted from his community because he knows too much and everyone else is devastated, right? They didn't grow up with 26 holy people, so they don't get him. And like, I might be the only one learning this song. And to this day, after he died, I think there's probably no more than a dozen that know it. So I feel like I'm wearing an intense lineage responsibility with that song today. And so he goes and he sings this song to us, you know, and I'm now getting the oral history thing kicking into gear. Like, I have to memorize this thing, and it's all in Lakota. Like, forget about it. Have you ever tried to learn Lakota? It might as well be Chinese, you know, it's like super intense. It's not like Spanish where you kind of like add an O at the end of all the words. So, anyway, I was like, let's learn one of his songs, you know, and the kids, they were so good about it, you know, because like, it was really hard to learn their first Lakota song. It took no less than like 9 weeks, you know. And they were coming for their nature program, but we take a good fat 45 minutes every week to be going over this Lakota language, you know. It was just so sweet, and their sweet little voices, you know. I'm like, this is going to be great. Of course, I don't know if he's going to come. Well, let's go for it, right? So the day comes, and we set this whole thing up, and he's doing like a whole weekend on ceremony after that, and so I call him up that morning, and I'm like, So Gilbert, you know, how'd you sleep last night? You know, he'd flown in, we set him up, and he's like, good, you know, kind of quiet. I said, so I got a little nature program going on today. What do you think about coming over, you know, and just maybe telling a story or two? You be up for that? Okay. But I play it off. Great, I'll come and pick you up, you know. So I come over there and he just goes with it, which was so great of him. I was really happy about that, you know. But I don't know if he knows what's going to happen, but somehow he decides to go for it. And he comes over, and you know, we go. I walk him up, and there's these like little scouts in the land. They're like, we're hiding behind trees, waiting for his arrival, sending signals, you know, running up and sneaking into this. You know what a Mandan Lodge is? It's a fire pit, and then 4 posts around it, and the posts go up, and they form a box here to about here. Then there's logs that go down in all the rounded directions, and it was a plains shelter, and normally grass grew up on that thing, and we like building those places to hang out, and it feels really good in there to have an indoor fire in an outdoor kind of setting. And we always did stories there at the end of the day. Storytelling and listening was a core routine that we did for a couple of years even before that, to build that listening power. And then after every story, we'd always say, tell me something that you heard in the story. What stood out to you? So they always knew every week after the story that question would come, and then we would pass something. So like they had like the moment with the rock or the stick or something where they were to speak or not speak about that question. You know, so they knew if, you know, we were looking for something, if anything, you know. Sometimes they'd say, I like the whole thing, you know. I was like, nice try, put that back there. Anyway, so we did that for a long time, and then we also did some things in preparation, which we called it the Silent Sit Challenge. And essentially it was a game. They were competing against the different age groups. So there was the 6 to 8-year-olds, the 9 to 11, and then the 12 to 15-year-olds in these 3 different groupings. And we created a competition to see who could sit quietest the longest. And we were pretty sure that our group was going to win, you know. So I said, there's no way that teenagers, I had the 10 to 12-year-olds, I think, there's no way they're going to beat us, you know. So let's just create an outrageous number right from the start, and they'll just struggle for like the next several months trying to beat our record, you know. They're like, great, let's do it, awesome. And so what it was we found a place in the woods where there was, I think there was like 12 of us, and we found a place that was an opening where there happened to be 12 trees, which was kind of cool. So it actually became a spot on the land that we only went to just for that activity. And we'd get our tree, right? We'd sit there and I said, okay, here's the rules. Rules are, you can't move a muscle. You can't, you have to close your eyes because you can't blink, right? The only thing you can do is breathe and swallow. You have to be really, because, you know, kids and rules, you got to know exactly what the rules are. After like 20 questions, it still came down to, you can only breathe or swallow. Breathe or swallow. That's it. I will have my eyes open. Yeah, okay. So, and then the first person who moves, the whole game's over. Right? So no one knows who the mover was. And I said, don't ask. I'm not going to tell you. But it's like a group challenge. So the longer the whole group goes, the longer the whole group time is. So it's kind of like they couldn't quite tell if they were doing well or if the group was doing well. So it was like so tightly related, you know? And so at the end, it was always like our win, you know, or our loss if we had a big setback. So we'd sit down, you know, and say, so I'd kind of give them a little chance on a roll in of like a sense meditation. So just feel the wind on your cheek, you know, and kind of get the ants out and listen to the birds. You might as well close your eyes now. What kind of birds are you hearing right now? And kind of give their mind a little something to feast on during that quiet time, right? Feel the ground beneath your butt, you know. Smell what's in the air. Take a deep breath. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay, time's up. Everyone, open your eyes. That was great. 4.5 seconds. They're like, no way, 4.5 seconds. Dude, can we do it again? Come on, can we do it again? Do it again. I'm like, maybe after lunch. Okay, let's go, everybody. You know? And they would beg me, begging, can we do this better? Come on, I know we can do better than 4.5 seconds. You're like, all right. Okay, I'll have to put off some curriculum for this. So we did, we kept working it up until we got to about 4.5 minutes. That's a long time for 10-year-old. 4.5 minutes. Have you ever tried that? That's a long time. Try 12 seconds, 4.5 minutes. It was awesome, and it was like, they were like this if they were weightlifting, they're like 4.5 minutes. And at the end of the day, we had our secret weapons, we didn't discuss our techniques at all, And we'd get into the man-man lodge and it'd be like check-in at the end of the day. Hey, how'd your day go? Older teens, middle group, and they'd be like, 4.5 minutes, Teens would be like, 4.5 minutes? It was like 1.5 minutes last week, they're like, fact, So teens were like really lagging behind. It was really hard for them, and they're just like feeling so good about it. Anyway, this was part of our preparation for Gilbert coming, and he comes that day, and the little scouts run into the lodge, and he walks in, and it's like got all the cultural kind of signals going on, Kids are packed against the wall. There's a beautiful fire burning. We have our best fire tender on the fire. Just, one smoky moment, and we're like, that stinks, right? So best fire tender, knows how to split the wood, gather the dry wood. There's even a firewood collector who brings the kindling to the fire tender, right? Using hand signals. And he walks in, and of course the seat that's open with blankets is on the west. And that kind of thing doesn't escape him because he's a constant four-direction compass. He knows all the time, no matter where he is, where the four directions are. Because they have meaning for him. So Wes is like, comes in and he sits in the west and he goes, and it's silent. It's like pin drop. Like, I don't know who just walked in, like the king of something or other, it's like pin drop, He's like, hey! Ha 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 ha! He kind of like just breaks out in this body laugh, like, he must have been so happy, right? And he's like, just launches off, he just launches into deep storytelling, like no pause, When I was a boy, my grandfather, used to have people come around because he was famous healer. People who saw Custer. And they would come in and they would talk about Custer's last stand and what actually happened there. And famous warrior would come into his camp, and I would be a little boy. And they come in and they start talking, and I'll say, Grandpa, what are they talking about? And he'd say, and he points to me and he like takes his big finger and he pokes me in the top of the head. He says, use your brain. This is what God gave your brain for. Use your brain and listen. Pay attention, and you will find out the answers to your questions. That's like what he opened with, And I was just like, he was like banging me on the head, I thought, this is so cool. Like, he's mentoring them in how to listen before he even tells the first story. How cool is that, But I don't think he's actually thinking his way through this. My sense is like that's how it was done for him. And I had a chance to take that thing and put it in the room straight to the children. And I felt so good about what they were getting from that experience. Direct body-to-body transfer from like old world to current world. And that's what I did over and over and over again for those children, following this map, this cultural mentoring map, where around the world there are these pieces that indigenous cultures have in common. And if 3 or 4 cultures did these things and they produced health and vitality, I wove them into my nature programs and into my extended community. And at the Art of Mentoring, we go over that map extensively, but we actually do it experientially, so you can kind of get the vibration. You can bring your kids, they can run around with other kids who are doing this, and we create the draft. Because if you plant, let's say there's a clear cut and you want to replant the forest, if you just put one tree in there, or one planting, it's going to experience all the wind and all the weather, and not enough soil. But if you plant a cluster of 25 things there, the birds will come in, they'll drop the leaves, they'll fertilize, it'll be more moist, it'll be protected. So it's like a cluster planting, We do this thing together to create cultural momentum that gives us an advantage to creating the direction we want to go. At the center of all this is the software reboot, which is return to nature. But it's not really complicated, you know. It's just making time for it and making time for it together so that it shares values. It has more message than just being out there, is that we value it and we value taking time for it. And the way we adapt to that builds resilience in our family, social relationships. When wind comes to tear the tarp off our greenhouse. Because if someone was like, you know, only been inside and not dealt with much tough stuff in their life and was kind of soft and comfortable and in a hospital bed, you know, how comfortable would they go out 2 o'clock in the morning and in the freezing wind and rain put this thing back up on that thing at a drop of the hat, right? It's almost like the investment we put in up front to building, the Bushmen of the Kalahari call it ropes. Building relationships, they say, they speak in metaphor, you know, it's like building a rope. Rope from me to you. And that rope can be a thin spider silk if it's kind of tenuous and things can break it and off we go. Or it can be like a ship's cable, you know, really thick and strong, like nothing could get between us. And the investment in that rope has to do with time and care and love and communication and trust. Like I'm doing with my daughter and the sugar maple. She will always know for the rest of her life what a sugar maple is, if I did nothing else. She will always know at that time of year when it is to tap trees, whether she taps them or not. She will have a profound body, visceral experience. That's ropes to nature. Imagine if we facilitated 1,000 ropes to different species and parts of the natural world. And we had 1,000 points of diversity that informed us. What kind of being would that be in community? Who would they become? What if that was their training for being a citizen in your community? Who would they be? Even if you invested in just 10 of them at a time over the course of 15 or 20 years. Like an experiment. The rest could go to school, you know, and get jobs and go to college and that pathway. But what if you invested in some of them that way? What would that be like? Who would they become? You know, it's like a special stock that you could return to in case your seeds start to go bad. You go back to the old seed stock, you know, go back to the cellar and be like, this was a really good, resilient, open-pollinated seed stock. Let's bring that back and propagate that back out again. Like an old apple tree, you know, that, you know, might have some good seeds and you could propagate the branches back, you know. Or maybe the whole darn village. You know, we don't have to keep it to 10. Everyone can be on this if you want it. It's a little radical, but it's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for doing something different. Doing something different. So building ropes is a really helpful metaphor. So look into your life and say, what kind of ropes do I have with my family? What kind of ropes do I have with my neighbors? Have I been feeding those ropes? Have I been tending them, weaving them? You know, it's almost like saying, how resilient am I? You know, if I fell over, would the ropes hold me up? Or am I teeter-tottering with 1 or 2 strands and, you know, if I'm off center, I fall over? And those ropes are two-way streets. And there's a bunch of learning I've done over time about how to create quality ropes with people. Most of it is an investment. It's an investment in time. What time is it now? I've lost track of our...
3.
Oh, okay. So we're going to pause there. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back inside, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of story about a community response. 2 stories about community response to change, and how tending the ropes of our relationships allow for a resilient response. So the plan is we're just going to go outside and just tune into the weather and the wind. There's going to be some light facilitation. We'll be in some groups. And I just wanted you to check Like, how you feeling right now, right? And then do your software reboot, and then come back in, and we'll just check in again, how you feeling now, and we'll just do that for ourselves. Invest in it a little bit. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Great. You're not the same people who left, though. Where'd all those people go? How do you feel now?
Much better.
Do you feel good? Yeah? Just shout out some things you're feeling right now. What are you feeling in your body?
Happy.
Happy?
Energized.
Energized? Refreshed? Look at the smiles. There's like ear-to-ear grins going on. What?
Tingly.
Tingly? Look at all the smiles. They're like enormous.
Awake.
Alive.
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 Alive. I like the sound of that.
Connected.
Connected. Yeah, it didn't take long, did it? Didn't take long. I have this theory that we're like 99.99% ancestral. 99.99% ancestral. That's what I believe.
It's in our memory, right?
It's in the
our
body.
memory.
Yeah, it's in
You're
like
not that far into
it's like in the body, right? You know, it's
Why
below
not-
the
Why
mind.
not 100%?
Why not 100%? We got to give something to something. I'm happy to go 99.999 if you want. If you want to fight me over that. You know why we're not 100? You know why we're not 100? Because we have to go outside to feel refreshed.
Oh, okay.
You know? But it doesn't take that long once we're there. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just whatever the reminder time is. You know? Whatever that reminder time is. And for some it's a little bit longer than others. But overall, I think, you know, we could do a simple analysis of like how long have we been around as human beings? You know, culturally speaking, 100,000 years? I don't even know what the real number is, but even if we used 100,000, right? This is 100,000 right here. How long has it been since we've done something like experimented with something like a different educational system called school? Because for most of that, we didn't have school, right? We did this invisible thing, learning thing called culture, right? I don't even think I can hold my thumb and finger apart, you know. A couple hundred years? What's fraction is 100 of 100,000? 1,000th? It's pretty tiny, huh? So that's like the 0.01 of us, or 0.001, you know, and the 99.999 is like most of our cellular memory. You know, literally like the development of our senses and our brain and our body and our vitality and our uprightness and our envisioning ability and our imagination and our heart connection with other things, compassion, all that stuff is really like, it's mostly ancestral. One thing I did recently that was amazing, someone set up a timeline for me on the ground. And they said, oh, let's go for a walk. Let's go on a 200,000-year walk. And every inch was 100 years?
Or every foot, maybe? Something like that.
Every foot was 100 years. Okay. So, so they set up all these things. So we were at the starting line, and he goes, okay, so way across the meadow over there is 100,000 years, and then we're going to go through the creek, and then 200,000 on the other side of that meadow over there. So let's go back in time. Every foot is 100 years. So this is the invention of computers. Yeah, and we went that far, you know. Here's the invention of cars and telephones, you know. Here's, you know, airplanes, you know. It's like, okay, there, 100 years ago. You know, already it was starting to sink in, like, wow. You know, I mean, it took a little bit of a stroll, and we hit some major landmarks, like, I don't remember. What was that?
Buddha, or Jesus.
Yeah, some hero stories in our big famous religions was, you know, 10 yards.
First evidence of ceremony. When
Well,
we
yeah.
started to get back.
Yeah, right. So these big landmarks, the big one, though, was when agriculture came in. And that was still only about 20 yards. So we went all the way across the meadow before agriculture as hunter-gatherers self. So we're like mostly hunter-gatherer. Walked and walked and walked and walked through hunter-gatherer world, and then way back there, way back there was things like sophisticated stone tool flint knapping. Things that are still hard to replicate today. Masters of the fine art of flint knapping surgical level tools, you know. And then way beyond that, in the other meadow, 200,000 years ago, was ritual burial. Ceremonial burial. And I thought, ceremony and ritual is deeply, deeply, deeply human, precedes all of these things. That really hit me. Ritual and ceremony. Something to keep in mind. And what does that mean? What does that mean? So just plant that seed. It's definitely in the cultural map, you know, for raising children. So we have, you know, this ritual with my daughter I was telling you about. Tapping the first tree is the promise of spring. And giving the hair, you know, and singing to the tree. Well, we went back at the end of the day, and sure enough, the tree was dripping. You know? It was dripping the very same day. It was dripping at the end of the day, and I was like, right on, you know? She said, "See, Papa, it works." I followed her and I went, "Yep, you're right," you know? So we do it every year now. And we did one other thing which made sense to me, is that we boil, right? And we boil and we boil and we get that first batch out. But before we take the first batch, we take a cup of the syrup and we pour it back out into the roots of the tree, as a reminder to always give back something so the trees will be sweet again next year. It's just that little bit of like pouring, like after all that work, pouring syrup back into the ground is a big moment. You know? But we get it. There's something we get about that. It's like, this is a circle. We are in a loop. We are not extracting forever an endless resource. We're giving back, and we honor and recognize the loop. And so, for her, for a while there, I think it was a literal loop. Like, we have to do that or it won't be sweet next year, you know? But at some point, the ritual becomes metaphorical, but somehow just as meaningful. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And the repetition of it is really important.
It's meaningful for the tree also.
We get to make that meaning. We get to make that meaning. And the habit of it, right? And who's there with the tree? Who makes that important? The whole family comes out. Takes the time to do that. If you were to chart your year, what do you take the time to do? That's the message you're sending your child about what's important. So you do a little inventory, like how much time do you spend on the computer? How much time do you spend in the car? How much time do you spend quiet outside? Fishing, gathering plants, gardening, singing, ceremony, listening to elders, reciting oral history. All sends the unconscious message constantly. You are basically marketing and advertising. And you get statistical results on how many ads you put on the air. Except we're talking about culture instead of consumerism. But it's the same kind of thing. They're using the same techniques that ancestors used. Repetition, mind's eye imagery, curiosity, sensory awareness. Right? They're using all the same approaches, but just directing culture from one thing to another. So we can just do the same things too, but we have to dedicate ourselves to it. So I said before break that I was going to tell you some responses to a community impact. In Hawaii, I guess this is kind of a tale of two cities story. In Hawaii, they have a chain of islands, and the island out towards the end is called Kauai. And there they have like a reservoir, like up in Tyrol in the mountains, of indigenous knowledge there, that because of the impact on the larger islands, you know, it's more like a little special stronghold there. It's like a place that didn't get fully conquered. So there's like an immersion language school there in the traditional Hawaiian culture, and there's practices going on there that are more extended family-ish than they would be considered modern. For example, children are shared amongst the houses there. At the end of the day, the kids need to be in someone's house, is what I'm told. You know, not like it has to be my house, my bed this time. It's just understood that they're somewhere, you know? Like the adults are kind of like the trees, and the kids are like animals moving through the forest. Right? They're free to make a lot of choices. They have a lot of sense of autonomy of their place, but they're held by a common ecology. So they develop a certain quality and connection to themselves and their place and all these different relatives. It's really kind of cool. They also have a lot of festivals. You know, they have a lot of food-based seasonal events that are coming up. So, you know, maple syrup season comes with festivals, pancake festivals, sugar on snow festivals, you know, whatever else you might want to do. And then when strawberries come, there's another one, you know. And when mangoes come, there's another one. You know, you could do whatever you want on an annual basis. The more you do of those, the better. Iroquois, I think, have 12 of those a year because they decided they wanted to celebrate the abundance of life rather than, you know, the weapons of war and the history of war and keep celebrating death and dying and wounds. They said, we need to flip that on its head and celebrate life. So there's all these different rituals they do, like the first berries. So then the contrasting story is the story of Katrina and New Orleans. So Hurricane Katrina came through and created a devastation in New Orleans, and there was chaos everywhere. And a lot of it had to do with the analysis in the end that there was a lot of pipeline communications all the way back to headquarters in Washington, D.C. These long kind of like parallel pathways of all these emergency services and people on the ground. And the hurricane, in essence, metaphorically knocked down all those pipelines. And people on the ground were not communicating with each other. They didn't have any relationships. That kind of investment would have been too inefficient. They've developed these efficiency pipelines, hierarchical pipelines, way back to Washington, right? But on the ground, paramedics and police and fire weren't communicating with each other. FEMA was not communicating with anyone. It took them days and days to get there from the outside because they couldn't communicate. They didn't know what to bring. They didn't know what to do. Chaos. In Kauai, they had a hurricane called Hurricane Aniki, which came in similar level power and hit the island, erased a lot of the vegetation, destroyed a lot of homes. Again, it took many, many days for FEMA to come in there. And what they found there is the people were celebrating, eating food, they had taken care of each other, the response was resilient and abundant. Anything they needed, they shared with each other. If their family was down, someone else helped them. Wherever the kids were at the time, they were safe. And it's because of the amount of time that they had spent and invested in those interrelationships on the ground over time that allowed them to be strong with a spontaneous thing like that. It took a lot of investment, but there wasn't any chaos on the ground. So, you know, in my life, I've been practicing this thing called extended family adoption. It's one of the things on the cultural points map. If you go around the world and you do some research on indigenous cultures or your ancestral lineage, even in recent times, you know, I was talking with Beverly, and it wasn't that long ago that grandparents lived in the houses with the families, and maybe that's happening here, but that practice is slowly fading away. It wasn't that long ago. Like my mom's mom, her grandmother lived in the house. I remember that when I was little. But my grandmother did not live in my house. So there was an extended family environment that was always happening. And in that intergenerational environment, you have more resources going towards the child. Of course, parents are busy, no matter what century we're talking about, right? Parents are busy. But the older generation is less busy. So in some ways, it's like in the wheel of life, the younger ones grow up to be mid-stage life, and then they become older ones again, and they're kind of closer together, actually, you know? This one elder I knew, he said, it's like a second childhood. I wet my pants and lose my teeth. He was always making fun because he was 92, you know, and he had some of those issues going on, but he was hilarious and super wise, man. His name was Ingwe. That's a whole other set of stories. There's a lot of people who've come into this bundle of teachings besides Gilbert. Lots and lots of different cultures, lots and lots of different people to build a very robust basket of knowledge that, you know, in case of emergency, break glass, break out the field guide to creating culture again, you know. So one of these things that all these places have in common, and lots of anecdotal stories, is extended family adoption. What is that? Well, not only are there histories of extended family living together, but non-blood relatives. And I learned this mainly through one of the people. His name is Paul Rayfield. He's a peacemaker with the Odawa Nation in the Great Lakes area. And this is part of the Anishinaabe Great Lakes tribes. And he was telling me that growing up, he had lots of aunties and uncles, and several grandmothers and several grandfathers. And, you know, through kind of questioning, I was like, well, what do you mean you had several grandmothers? Like, you mean 2? He's like, no, 3, 4, 5, you know. And I'm like, well, which ones were your real grandmothers? And he's like, well, they were all my real grandmothers. And he just wouldn't budge, you know. Like, eventually I had to figure out he wasn't going to tell me, you know, I only had 2 blood grandmothers, you know. It was all the same to him. He just was not going to go against that. And so then I asked him some more questions, and I learned even through Lakota, one of their 7 sacred ceremonies is the taking of relatives. So they formalize this thing into a ritual, a ceremony. If there's somebody that you're connecting with in your village, and there's something like you're sharing a certain worldview with them, or closeness, or, you know, in a large matrix of people, sometimes your blood family are not the ones you're closestly connected to in terms of a spiritual path. There's always like who you mentor in terms of your craft or your guild. Does that make sense? You might go to someone else to learn plants, or someone over here to learn woodworking. Or it might be your parents or your uncle or your auntie or something, you know. But so they have a ceremony where you can adopt someone, and in front of everyone else, you just basically name this commitment for the rest of your life. And that could be your niece or your nephew, your brother or your sister, or grandmother or grandfather, and it just kind of happened on a regular basis. So Paul, at one point, we had this moment with some teenagers, and I facilitate boys' rites of passage. It's one other one on the Cultural Points map that I find is like really essential in human development. There's something that's really needed and wanted in adolescence that is skipped over or missed, creates some serious dysfunction not only in the adults but in the culture in general. Like, we still have an adolescent culture if that doesn't happen. We get adolescent presidents running the country, you know, and south of the border. So I'm really interested in a mature population. I'm interested in men who have a conduct of protecting and providing, who have an ethic of other, and have learned what is their gift and purpose. So all that gets set around early adolescence. And in that environment of initiation, what are they getting initiated into? You know, another word for initiation is to initiate, to begin something. And I like to think of it as a beginning of expectation of adult conduct, way of being that forwards a healthy culture, right? And so what are these qualities, you know? Have integrity, you know, your word of honor is the only thing you have. Do what you say you're going to do, right? Come from a place of compassion, speak your truth, listen before making judgments, all sorts of things that can be held in that container, and then mentored over time and reinforced, kind of like those TV jingles I'm talking about. But what reinforces it is relationship. You can't really have rites of passage if you don't have long-term mentoring and adoption. That's a clue I came across. Like you can't really have a rite of passage that's like a birthday party. where it kind of comes and goes. Like someone will call me up and say, hey, I know we don't know each other, but would you do a rite of passage for my son? He's turning 13 next month, and it would be really great. I really would like him to have a rite of passage. And I'm like, ma'am, I don't know who you are, you know. Tell me a little about who you are, you know. And I go, second of all, like, where's the dad, you know? We're not really should be talking about this, you know. I need to talk to the dad. She's like, well, he's, you know, no. Right? And then the third question is even worse than the first two. It's just not going to happen. I said, we could get to know each other. Tell you what, I have a summer camp this summer. Have him come to my summer camp. Let's see if we even connect, because that's also pretty fundamental. Like, he and I need to connect for it to be authentic. Otherwise, he's going to be like, this is bogus. You know, teenagers, they're like, they smell the unreal a mile away. They want real. This isn't real, like, forget it, you know? They're challenging that way. I kind of like it. I like to be challenged about being authentic, you know? But I also say, yeah, but it's a two-way street. I'll facilitate rites of passage for you and wilderness challenges and survival in exchange for you respecting what I have to say. So, if we develop an agreement, I expect you to follow it. Because you're not going to find another adult out there who's willing to do what I'm doing for you right now, I'll tell you that. Name 10 other people who are willing to put you out on a wilderness solo. I can't think of 10. How about 2? I can't think of 2. All right then. This is a privilege. And it's a risk for me to trust you. To put you out on solo, alone out there with just a knife, that's a risk that I'm going to take. And your parents trust me with that risk. So what are you willing to do for me? So when I'm giving you an important instruction, I expect you to listen. You know, that kind of listening I was talking about with Gilbert. Right? If there's things you need to prepare for that and you don't prepare, you're not going. Right? And so it's cool. Like, they like that edge. They're like, okay, I'm going to rise to the occasion. And this is kind of uncle talk. It's very different than parent talk. You know, if my dad were saying that to me, I'd kind of go, are you done? Okay. I don't know what that is. It's just kind of goes right up there, you know? It's not in the blueprint of a father-son relationship. It's uncle-nephew, you know? And the same would be true for the women. It's like different channel on the radio. You know? It's a different channel of communication. Same words, different channel. In fact, the connection between the auntie and the mother is vital. Between the father and the uncle is essential. In fact, you could call them brothers and sisters, like that close. That's who you'd want to be an auntie or an uncle to your child. So before you can even have a rite of passage, you need aunties and uncles. And before you have aunties and uncles, what do you need? Who said that?
Brothers and sisters.
In the back row, 10 points. I figured this out through a long 5-year journey with Paul Rayfield. Finally came to that. Oh, I need to develop close relationships with other men before I can even have a relationship with their children on that level of culture repair called rite of passage. I made a lot of trial and errors up until then that were sort of effective. But once I got that, I was like, oh, that's the real deal. So then there becomes a much more slower long-term plan about actually building relationships with other people in my peer group. And then from there, building relationships with their children. And then from there, long-term mentoring, even after it's over. It's a big commitment. It's a big commitment. And even though it's a long toss, it's the most effective thing I've ever seen. It's kind of like, hurry up and slow down. Great long-term dividends from this process. In a way that there's just as many disappointments from the short-term ineffective things, this one is extremely effective and provides long-term dividends. And it has a lot of investment in it. So again, it's got that same equation. It's not a really good business model. You're not going to make a lot of money doing this. But I kind of think of it as my 401k plan. Someone said to me once, so this is really great, this whole wilderness thing you're doing, and I really get the whole culture thing, and I'm totally on board. You know, I'm like totally on board. But my dad asked me the other day, like, so do you have like a retirement plan? And I said, Dad, I don't know. Let me talk to Mark about that. Mark, so yeah, they have such a good question. My dad, you know, he's kind of like old school, and he like did this whole thing, and he has a retirement plan, and he wanted to know, what's my retirement plan? I didn't know what to tell him, so what's your retirement plan? I never asked you. And I said, the teenagers. He's like, say more. I'm like, well, I'm actually investing in these human beings for the first 20, 30 years of their life, and I actually expect a return from that in the long run. That's who I'm going to look to for support and care later on. That's my 401k plan. I'm choosing to believe in that future. You like that? So there's a lot to learn there around mentoring adolescents. That's definitely a skill set that needs to be developed, and some have that more than others. You know, it's a specialty in the community. And you want to start looking for those people who's particularly good with adolescents. And they're kind of an adolescent themselves. That's kind of a clue. They might have been angry as a teenager. They might have been a rebellious activist. They might have gone out west. Just kidding. Anyway, but you know, there's a set of skill sets there around mentoring teenagers, which is different. You know, one of them is you have to be willing to have them not like you for periods of time, and that's okay. You have to be willing to stand your ground and be really solid in your values. In fact, you might just want to do that for a period of life just to be tested by them. They will grill you over what do you believe in or not, and they will test you to see if you're on any shaky ground. It's a really harrowing experience, really. The first time I worked with teenagers, I cried. I did. I was like, I don't like this. They're so mean to me. I want them to be my friend. It's true. Don't tell anybody. So, I was going somewhere about something. What was it? Teenagers, extended family. Oh, so I've been working on extended family myself, and throughout the years, prior to the art of mentoring, prior to having a child, you know, I still was working on this, and through the art of mentoring, practicing these things, learning from native people, doing my own research, and then building relationships, slowly adopting people as I felt comfortable with them. So people, like when my daughter turned 7, I created a ceremony around her shifting from a little child to a big child. And it was kind of great. It was like a practice adolescent ceremony. Wasn't a lot of edge needed there, you know. She was like in the joy of her 7-year-oldness, and it was all about springtime and flowers and who are the people in her life who love her, and just start setting up those relationship roles now. And I took the time to go to each one of them and say, you know, how would you feel about, you know, being adopted as family with me? They're like, oh yeah, dude, of course, you know, we hang out all the time, you know, and like, you always feel like we're like brothers. Like, yeah, it's like, well, let's just name that. That we're from now on, we'll be brothers, you know. And that means you're uncle to my child. And he thought about it some more, and he said, okay. He said, that means you'll be uncle to my son. I said, I know. I said, and when he's an adolescent, I'll lead him through a rite of passage, program or no program. So that day, there was 10 other people in that circle who were really important people, and I took some time to build that group because we wanted to be conscious about it. And there was a grandmother character there who we asked to facilitate, and it was her preschool teacher for 5 years, and that was really sweet. And some auntie figures, and then there was a couple teenagers there who had been through rites of passage, who were babysitters and friends of the family at this point. It was really great to have them just kind of ahead of her there, holding themselves in a certain way, because I think in a way she looks to them more than the adults, you know? It's kind of an attraction who's just ahead, like a coming attraction, you know? At the family party, it's always the little ones following the next ones, and then the next one's following the next ones, like a little choo-choo train. You ever see that? So, then from there, you know, there was a lot of that relationship. They let her know, you know, from now on, there was, you know, you're in the care of your parents for a long time as a little girl, but becoming a big girl now, I can develop a direct relationship with you, right? So you can always talk to me when we're at parties together, you know, when I see you at my house playing with my son, you know, we can connect, okay? Me and you, hello, I'm a human being, right? And so that's what happened. And that's been really great for her. A lot of people paying attention to her because of the title. Because of the title, it makes all the difference. I was at Paul Rayfield's reservation last weekend, and it was a cross-cultural exchange around music. And it's kind of basically like hanging out, playing music with family. But he calls it Rockin' the Res. And so at the after party, we're hanging out in this house, and this little one runs up to me, and she says, Uncle, look at this. You know? Like, I don't even know who this is, right? It's like his granddaughter, right? Uncle, look at this. I'm like, whoa, anything you want, you know? Anything you want. Isn't that sweet? Imagine a little thing coming up to you saying, Uncle. Now, it's just like, as a fish, that's the water she's swimming in. Anyone who's the same age as her parents is an auntie or an uncle. The kids there start there. They start there. There's like a condition of trust that if they're there, they're auntie or uncle already. And the fact that this is so wild, it's like not like anyone told her to call me uncle. That's what she does. And when she calls me uncle, there's some magical thing that goes, bzzzt, rope, from me to her. She's a relation of mine instantly. And now that she's a relation of mine, this is like below the brain kind of stuff I'm talking about. Now that she's a relation of mine, I'm caretaking for her. I feel village instantly. Her parents could be long gone out of the room, and I'll be making sure she's okay. It's really cool. So what if we had that, you know? So that's what I've been experimenting with, you know, and I had a blunt impact this past year in 2010. I was in an 18-year marriage, and we got divorced. And that was devastating for me because I had a lot of concerns given my consciousness, right? Like this was going to ruin my daughter's life. And I resisted the change for a little while. And I wanted to just collapse. But I had a lot of people who propped me up. Remember all those ropes I was talking about? I had people who I could call and we could sit with. I actually had a counsel. It was my divorce counsel. There were people 10 to 15 years older than me that had gone through death or divorce. People who were on a path and could listen to me and guide me. And so they helped me regularly through the whole process. And I never actually ended up collapsing. And that was important for my daughter, right? She didn't have to wear any of it. She didn't have to wear any of the burden like, uh-oh, Papa's falling apart, I've got to hold it together, or any of that, you know. I was able to be present for her because of the support that I got. And then I moved out of my house, and it was, where do I go? What do I do now? 18 years is a long time. And so there were some people in my community that were extended family with me, non-blood, starting with a teenager who I had put through a rite of passage several years before. And his mom, who had been in some of my adult programs, and the grandfather, who had done elder training with us, and Melodoma Somé. So they were all pretty much like on the path to creating this regenerative culture. We spent a lot of time together in the last 7 years. So they're like, well, you know, we're thinking about moving up from Massachusetts anyway. Why don't we all get a house together? I'm like, great. So instead of just me buying like a rental with a crappy little basement, you know, and trying to find a place for my daughter, we got this really nice big house. Like we could all share the resource. It's a beautiful place. It's got 10 acres, and you can see views of the mountains. And it's got a rope swing out front with a tire on it. Big old oak tree there. And it's a lovely place. And my daughter gets to live in this extended family environment every time she comes, every other week. And so when she comes in there, you know, Hank, the elder, he'll be at the Art of Marrying this summer. he has a special elder apartment down in the basement, you know, where he has his own shower and like a stove and a separate entrance, you know, so it's like really perfect for him. And I'm like, go see if he needs anything to eat, you know, so I can send her on an errand down there. And she's like, Grandpa, you know, do you need anything to eat, you know? And then she's down there for like an hour. You know, she's just gone for an hour, you know, like, I know what's going on down there, right? He's 83. He's had a huge life. He's got all this cool stuff down there that's like unlike anything I have. Tools and copper wire and stories about being a museum replica restorer for the Metropolitan, you know, and it's back up an hour later, like, totally forgot what she went down there for, you know. It's a beautiful intergenerational experience we're having. And the mother, Valerie, she likes to spend a lot of time with her. She's like, look, my son's 18, he's done with his mom, you know. Anytime you need a little auntie time, just let me know. I'd love to be with your daughter. You know, 10's a beautiful age, right? So it's great. So she wants to be with her a lot of the time. I don't feel taxed at all. We're all interested. And then Aji, who's 18 now, I've invested a lot of time and energy into his life. And that 401k plan, you know, the dividends are coming back because he's a beautiful mentor to her. Because he's got the energy and he's got the embodiment of what it means to be mentored. So he's like, hey, Lucia, what are you doing? You want to go outside? Come on, let's go. You know, out the door they go. So between these 3 generations, it's like, wow, like, why would she ever need to go to school, for example, you know? She's going to get so much just from that living environment. So what could have been a completely devastating impact on my life actually was something that had a surplus to it because of the amount of investment and time and relationship and extended family that had happened over the last 10 years. So those are some of my stories. And I offer these things for you because I'd like to see people in different parts of the world start rebuilding culture again according to the values they want to have and keep. And I get to travel the world and see how people are doing and share stories with each other. So it's kind of like, you know, a big cultural renewal going on globally. A lot of people are sharing the stories about how they're doing. So if you have a success here, I can share it with California, you know. And if in California there's something good going on, I can share it with Tyrol and so on. Like we're going to Scotland this year. And I'm really excited to see what they have. I wanted to just take a pause here and see if people had any questions or comments about anything. And before we do that, what I was going to do is give you a chance to turn to a partner. Because one of the things I do with initiation and rites of passage is this kind of simple 3-step process that is as old as the hills. It goes back 1,000 years. It's called the hero's journey model. That when we go on a journey, there's usually a call to adventure and then a threshold into the unknown. Kind of like a speed bump. It takes a little something to get over it, or it bounces you back. Just to make sure you're in for the right game. And then when you go on that unknown journey, there's training and discipline, trial and error, and learning going on. And then there's a little speed bump on the way back up. You know? And then reintegration. How do you fit back in with this new stuff? How do you weave yourself back into the whole? So if today we're like a little hero's journey, one of the questions I have is, now what? Now what? Was there something that opened up for you here today that you want to take home with you? And it might have been just a good story and that's that, right? Or it might have been like, oh, you awoke in something that I've been thinking a lot about, but I've just kind of put aside. Now I want to pick it up. And it's this. Well, what I know is if we want different results, we have to actually do something different in our life. If we do the same thing, we get the same results. And you're going home to the same program that you left this morning. What's something you would do differently to get that new result going? Create some movement around creating regenerative culture. Creating this community that has the children and nature at the center of it. So let's just stir the pot a little bit and see what's there.